This week, Eugene Spafford, who we lovingly refer to as Spaff, from Purdue University, is here with us to discuss cybersecurity myths. Then in the security news, option ROMs are a novel way to compromise a system at the lowest level. Synclose opens AMD processors up to attacks. At home, in your firmware, exploiting SMM, complete with examples. Sonos speakers get hacked and enable attackers to listen in on your conversations. The DEF CON badges use new chips and are not without controversy. Lasers that can steal your passwords. It was a regex. Larry updates us on some IoT research. Attackers have your social security number, and more updates from last week's Hacker Summer Camp. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. It's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
SOC analysts are often overworked and underappreciated. In fact, many consider leaving their jobs or changing careers altogether. Devo is hosting the 4th annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day to give analysts long overdue kudos and encourage organizations to improve their job satisfaction and mental well-being. Join Devo and other cybersecurity industry professionals on October 16th for sessions and panels focused on de-stressing, SOC career development, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Devo to register. Quick question, do your end users always, and I mean always, without exception, work on company-owned devices and IT-approved apps? I didn't think so. So my next question is, how do you keep your company's data safe when it's sitting on all those unmanaged apps and devices? 1Password has an answer to this question: Extended Access Management. 1Password Extended Access Management helps you secure every sign-in for every app on every device because it solves the problems traditional IAM and MDM can't touch. Check it out at securityweekly.com/1Password. Coming to you from Purgatory Studios in semi-high definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself, this is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 839, being recorded on Wednesday, August 14th, 2024. I am your host, Paul Asadorian, joined in studio by Mr. Larry Pesce.
Yes, after a whirlwind tour for a couple weeks, to go back on a whirlwind tour again next week.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
I mean, yeah.
Where are you going next week?
Amsterdam.
Oh, teaching?
Damn.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, yeah.
So you're going to a land far, far away.
2 weeks ago was Chicago. Last week was Vegas for summer camp. Next week is Amsterdam. I'm home for a week. I'm back in Vegas. I'm home for a week, and then I'm back in Amsterdam.
Racking up the miles.
Yep.
Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
Great to be here. I am also freshly returned from a week in Vegas and a whole bunch of other places before that, but not nearly as fun as Amsterdam or Chicago.
Awesome. Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us.
Hey, Paul. It's been a long time, like a day or two.
Yeah,
you know,
pretty much, man. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it was only since we were the only people that didn't go to Vegas out of like the entire hacker tribe. It's kind of ridiculous.
Right. Next year. Our guest for this evening is, well, none other than Spaff. Spaff needs no introduction. He's been doing computer science and computer security long before I was. We'll just put it that way. Spaff, it's wonderful to have you back here on Paul's Security Weekly.
Hey, it's great to be back here with you again.
So you got your hands, I think you got your hands in a lot of different pots today, Spaff, but we wanted to focus in on, I believe it was your early 2023 released book on cybersecurity myths, which kind of stems from the way you described it to me. Is you started your career in microcode, which is interesting because I actually do some stuff with microcode, mostly begging vendors to release patches for it today. Started off in microcode and really technical things, but then realized you could have more of an impact if you transition to more of the policy side. Did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, pretty much. I think what happened in the early days is I kept seeing the same patterns over and over again. As technology was released, as people looked at it, there are only so many buffer overflows you can really see and analyze before realizing that there's something else that must be driving the problems.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm fascinated with the history of vulnerabilities in particular, and we can date some of them back to early 60s, 70s. So they're not novel and new. I think the null pointer dereference was, someone noticed in like early 1970s.
Yeah, there are some classic papers that go back into the 1960s. Some of the work that was done in the early Ware report, the early Anderson report, discuss programming errors, architectural problems, and at that time they were not new even then.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. So that transitions you to not so much policy, but helping shape the way we think is the way I phrase that. Would you agree with that?
I'm trying. I'm not sure how successful I am in every occasion, but I have been involved of really focusing some of my efforts on issues of awareness, of policy, of education, and as well some on professionalism, because we need to do more of a transition from uh, hobbyist and infosec janitor into realms of real professional engineers.
Yeah, and it is the ethics component more important today in computer technology than before because it's so pervasive. Is that one of the things that drives it?
I think the reason that it's more important now is because we are using computing in more security critical, financial critical, privacy critical, and life critical situations. When if we were to go back even 30 years ago, a lot of what we were doing was office support or scientific calculation. It was not as important as some of the real-time control, some of the work that's being done now in the financial industry and a medical area. So it's really the data and the processing that have changed more so than the hardware.
Mm. And
Isn't it?
what?
Isn't it also true?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I mean it's the dependence of just about everything on computers and technology and networking these days. It's not just the different areas. It's just, I mean, the world comes to a stop if, like, some vendor throws out a patch that brings systems down.
Well, that's certainly a component of it. If you think about things that we used to do manually that are now under computer control, those things tend to have wider ranging effects. Uh, and the more we use OT technology, which isn't really looked at as much, it's beginning to gain more attention, that we're putting more critical applications, time critical and process critical applications in the realm of computing. So it's a combination of these factors, and we need to be more aware of what the impact is.
So, Spaff, what drove you to help author the this book, which is not your first book, obviously, Cybersecurity Myths and Misconceptions?
Uh, I was having a conversation with my co-authors, and I don't remember exactly what prompted that, but it was I've known Josiah Dykstra for a very long time, and I think we had started the conversation, and he brought Lee Metcalf in because they had had some similar conversations, and we started talking about, well, what are really the root causes of some of the problems that we've seen? Why don't people learn from some of the lessons that we've accumulated over the decades? And we realized it was in part due to things people believe that aren't really true or think they understand but don't. And we started making a list of those and came up with uh, eventually the book covers over 175 of them,
Wow.
but it was fairly easy to come up with a list, and we decided we ought to write about this. We were having a lot of fun talking about it, and we started writing it up, and it really just flowed once we started
Mm.
putting them down.
One of the myths that you and I discussed, Spaff, was that people believe that users are the weakest link. And I think it's a great example of these things that when you get into cybersecurity, you hear and then you just tend to believe, sometimes without questioning it. Why is that a myth?
It's a myth because across the broad spectrum of computer use, many of those users are in fact the people who are the administrators and the security personnel. And it's also in environments where those individuals are trained or could be trained to be part of the security process itself. It's very seldom that we have any kind of business environment or scientific environment where the end user population is actually interested in having the systems compromised or doesn't care if they lose their capabilities. They actually do care. They want to be part of it. But if they don't get the tools, if the systems aren't designed so that they can use them well, and if we don't present them with the options and the support, then they cannot be part of the security process. But if we give them the tools, the support, the training, they can actually be part of the process to alert us when things go wrong, to be able to do the settings correctly, to be able to support the decisions that are made. And it's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If we dismiss that population by saying they're the weakest link, they're not going to be a part of the strong links that we need to protect the systems.
Does that address like another myth? Do you think that users believe that the computer systems and software and services they use are secure by default, already secure, and therefore they don't have to have this heightened state of awareness or do things to help improve the safety and resiliency of our systems?
Yeah, there are two parts to that. And one part is that if we step back and separate them from the system, then they will view the securing and the privacy of the security of the system as not their responsibility. And if you think about other environments where we have people working, we have issues such as fire safety is everybody's responsibility, as an example. And it's built in because they realize that they are a component. If we separate people from securing the systems, then they won't want to be part of it. If we penalize them for trying to be part of it, so for instance, if someone, because of a mistake or lack of training, clicks on a link that causes a problem, if they're afraid to report it because they're going to be disciplined, they're
Right.
not going to report it. They're going to hide it, which means the problems just get worse. So that's one aspect of the problem. And then the other aspect also is held by the people who buy the products, configure the systems, and run them. And that's the belief that what vendors provide them is secure, or that vendors, particularly those of cybersecurity products, have their security as a priority in mind. And those are not true, uh, which is surprising. But if
Say
you
it
think
ain't
of,
so.
Are
Vendors
you
don't provide secure
suggesting
products.
there are no solutions?
no, I'm not saying there's no solutions. I'm just saying that defaults are not what people think they are. Uh, Companies are not in business to primarily secure your system. They are in business to sell you their products. And therefore, they are going and not only just sell the products, but to make a profit from it. So they're not going to go all out to run every possible kind of testing against their products, dynamic and static analysis, use formal methods, using best product languages. That costs too much. So they're going to make a best effort because they need to be competitive in the market. And then when they ship it to you, generally the configuration, the default configuration, is the one that installs with the fewest possible side effects because they don't want to have to deal with the help desk requests, the chat requests for why isn't this working on my system. They would much rather ship it effectively wide open so everything plugs in and works seamlessly so that most customers don't complain. That's why, for instance, Microsoft Windows supports things that have run on every version of Microsoft Windows back to the Stone Age. It's those are not necessarily secure features, but it's because it causes fewer complaints for people who have an investment in what they have already or putting into operation.
It's often said that security is a process, right? And we're jumping between two of the myths here, but
Yep.
when it, and I think it applies to both, but in the user context, I think a lot of security benefits are derived from having a really solid tested process. My analogy or example is my wife works in the medical field, wrong side surgeries.
Yep.
Now, they can easily attach a cost in many different aspects, a cost to a wrong side surgery, right? Monetarily, obviously, it costs the hospital a lot of money, and there's also patient care. The patient is harmed in the process. So the way they combated that problem, and it's interesting. I watched this, kind of unfold. Is before every surgery they do multiple timeouts. I want to believe they call them, where everyone in the room, not just the surgeons, not just the nurses, but radiology, everyone stops what they're doing and they all go through the details of what's about to transpire, right? I feel like the way we combat business email fraud, right, is with a similar kind of procedure. And it's not a technology solution. This is an education and a process.
It's a culture.
Yeah.
In the culture. Yes. Everyone is aware at the hospital that wrong side surgeries are a bad thing, and they all need to follow this procedure, and they're all on board.
There's also a high-tech part of the solution, Paul, at least in your medical analogy, and that is the invention of the Sharpie. And they write all over the leg. This is the leg.
This is the leg.
One of the mechanisms that's used in a number of safety critical applications, for instance, pilots have checklists. And even if they've done whatever it is they're doing 1,000 times, they learn to go through the checklist to verify every step. And that forces them to take the time to repeat what's necessary as a process. We also see that at things like nuclear power plants. And there have been some studies that have shown that for surgery, if surgeons use a checklist, including checklist for all the surgical items that they use, not only are they less likely to do wrong side surgery, they're also less likely to sew up forceps or sponge inside the patient. Having those records and checklists to go through and practice that on a regular basis works out better. And the same for cybersecurity.
Yeah. Hey, Spaff, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
After the book was sent to the printer, what is the myth that you went, crap, I wish we'd put that in? Or one that you couldn't add for space reasons or whatever. Which one made you like, darn it?
I don't think we've got one in there like that. I regret we didn't say more about privacy.
Really?
Really, the book was focused on cybersecurity, but privacy is related, and I wish we'd said more about that. It also went to the printer a little bit before this frenzy over AI started, so we didn't say as much in there as we could probably say now.
That sounds like you need to write a second edition.
We're actually thinking about it.
Let me know.
But
I've got a few for you.
That'd be great. The problem is, I don't know if it's a problem, but people don't seem to buy books much anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure the publisher would want to support doing a second edition unless everybody out there listening to this podcast buys several copies to give to everybody they work with. Then maybe.
There's ways to make it work. You could do smaller versions of it that are specific for a vertical, like the OT myths. Eclipsean would use as a marketing piece.
Well, that would be an interesting idea. Right now, it's been translated into Japanese and is making very good sales in Japan.
Nice.
And there's an audio version, although that misses some of the snark we had in the footnotes.
Oh, interesting. Because I have the audio version. I haven't listened yet, but it's on my list to listen. Yeah.
It also doesn't have the wonderful illustrations that we have in the print book that coincidentally were done by my wife.
There you
Oh,
go.
really?
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
She's very talented.
she is. She it's interesting being in a regular day-to-day environment with somebody that I'm very technically and engineering oriented. She's very artistically oriented, and between us, we look at the world in a lot of different ways that turn out to be quite instructive.
Spaff, I want to go back to AI for a moment. What are
Sure.
some of the common misconceptions or myths about AI that we have today? Because it's exploded. I think as we established, artificial intelligence has been around since, I mean, early projects we can date back to the 60s, right?
How about
Yes.
AI is that a misconception?
Yeah, I would say that it is intelligence. It's not.
Mm.
Uh, the idea of AI actually goes back to Turing, the Turing test, right? That's he wrote
Mhm.
about that. He wrote about the whole idea of computability. There's a lot of interesting work that's been done in philosophy of mind, which is epistemology. How is it we know what we know? Uh, and psychology, physiology about what is intelligence. That's all sort of by the wayside here as we look at AI, which is really machine learning. It's building models that are based on statistics and repeated training with data. That's what people are using now. And the probably the biggest myth is that people who don't understand that are believing that there's actually some form of intelligence that is answering their questions. And so they're using the output of these systems to make decisions or provide material that they believe is correct, that they believe has some intelligence behind it, and maybe even some empathy. And none of those things is true. It's
Right.
Is
simply
it is it is it really just a bunch of if statements, Spaff?
um, much of it could be reprogrammed that way, although you wouldn't want to.
Mm-hmm.
It is generally networks of probabilistic reasoning that are sort of if then else Markov chain kind of choices that are embedded in matrices inside the system, but it isn't reasoning. It is statistical modeling of inputs.
And
Right.
to
It's
an
still
extent,
conditional statements,
I
but
mean,
applied
slight
to a
pushback.
modeling. Yeah.
So are
Yeah.
we to a certain extent.
Um,
There's an
possibly,
aspect. Yeah.
possibly. That's that's one of the things that isn't really known is
Right.
what is consciousness? Where does our thought originate? Is it electrical? Is it chemical? Is it something else? There's some speculation that there's actually some quantum mechanism that's involved in thought. The question of is it predetermined? Or is predestination a thing? Is it random? All of these are really interesting questions that have
Yes.
not been definitively addressed.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting if we don't understand that, how can we build something that mimics ourselves if we don't understand ourselves?
In very limited ways.
Mm.
Yep. Yeah.
But it's more like artificial, whatever we think intelligence is at any given point in time. But I don't know what the acronym for that would be.
Mm.
There, one of the original ideas behind artificial intelligence was to use computing to build an intelligence like any of us would presumably demonstrate. But because that underlying question of what is intelligence, where does it originate, couldn't really be answered, it morphed into can we build systems that derive answers that match what intelligence would derive? And that's where a lot of this generation
Mm.
of things come from. The idea is it just ingests a lot of information. It has guidance in a model to say how it should pick various things, and it comes up with answers that often, but not always, are similar to what a person might respond. And the problem there is the people who fall for the matching of this, that it looks like they're having something that is reasoned,
Mm.
and depend on it. And then of course you get the hallucinations, or
Right.
even a hallucination is something that implies consciousness, cognition, and that isn't correct. It's really just statistically wrong responses.
Is part of the myth Spaff that AI today is a tool, not necessarily a solution, right? Because the way I use it today is, yes, to solve problems, but it's more like another tool in my tool chest. It's not like a full blown solution.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it. There have been experiments that have been done that people without sufficient background, and this goes back to the idea of users being the weakest link, will believe the output of technology over checking the results on their own.
Yeah.
So there was a classic experiment done in the 70s where calculators were just being introduced, and a classroom of engineering students were given calculators to solve a test. And the calculators were engineered so that every time they were used, they would start generating answers that were further and further from correct. And the students, after practice with these originally, were given this test and they copied down whatever they got out of the calculator, even if it was off by 5 orders of magnitude, if they just
Mhm.
stopped to think about it.
Right.
That's a problem. That goes back to what I was saying about where I've been working in education and in ethics and training, about users being the weakest link. All of this is related, that because it's done by a computer doesn't necessarily mean it's correct or better. And as we start putting in critical applications, like maybe running our automobiles, uh, it can do better in some circumstances, but it doesn't mean it is better. Uh,
Well,
we're
I think you said something earlier about our beliefs, and we see this on social media as an example all the time. That imperfect beliefs are filtering, so we're filtering those to make quick decisions.
Yep.
And that's oftentimes why on social media we'll believe something if it's in an image and state something, and we can digest that, right? Because we're overloaded with a whole of feeds, multiple feeds of all this stuff.
Yeah. As beings, as perceptual and thinking beings, we're constantly doing abstractions. Uh, Not to go down this deeply, but if you study in the area of cognitive psychology and sensing, what we see visually, we're able to see much more than we actually remember or process because it's too much information. So our
Yeah.
visual system abstracts out important points. Our memories abstract out important points because we can't remember every detail, unless there are some people that do, but let's just say on average.
Mm-hmm.
So we naturally do that, and bombarded with lots of information, such as social media as an example, some things will resonate more because they have an emotional impact or they match preconceptions.
Right. They match people's already existing beliefs.
Yep. Or they're
And you know where I'm going with this with
shocking.
electronic vehicles are a prime example.
Yes.
I see people believing that that's I'm like that's completely not true. Like I own an EV, I'm like that's just not true. But it matches beliefs in certain populations that have preconceived notions and beliefs, and people will actually post information to back that up, even though incorrect, and that's what people believe.
We also have an effect that the technology changes very quickly. So something that may have been true 20 years ago
Right.
is no longer true, and they haven't accommodated that difference. Although I believe the very first cars produced were electric by Daimler in Germany.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and it
no.
turns
Yep,
out,
in the 1890s.
yep. Um, but this kind of belief, cars is a good example. How often do you see these stories of people who follow the GPS and drive into a lake?
Yeah.
Yep.
Turn right in
Yes.
40 feet.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's an example of where people have, well, it must be correct because the computer's telling me. And we have to do a better job educating people and providing systems with guardrails so that those kind of things don't happen.
But that feeds right back into cybersecurity, Spaff, because there's so many more myths that we haven't touched upon that really grind my gears, but also are very dangerous when it comes to cybersecurity.
Like what?
And examples are like which vulnerabilities to pay attention to, which
Yep.
solutions I should implement so my company can be more secure. All of those, we've been talking about those for years.
I would say underlying that, I wrote the first chapter um, chapter 1 of the book, about the fact that we do not have a shared definitive definition of what security is. If you ask 100 people to define what security is, you will probably get 102 different definitions. We found that NIST, the national standards body, had 3 published definitions of what cybersecurity is. So, what that leads to in part is we don't have good metrics to determine if A is better than B. Should we invest $100 more to get C? How is that going to work in my environment? And we have a lot of people who are attempting to improve security without knowing what, as you said, which vulnerability to fix first or which thing to address first. And it leads to a certain amount of confusion because we can't compare things very well or measure them. This is what I was saying, going from hobbyist and janitor to engineer is to be able to have reproducible results like this, that we can measure and make decisions. And we're not there yet.
One thing
hold
we
on,
were talking about.
Paul,
Go ahead, Jeff.
if I may. But Spaf, I mean, you and I were involved in another agency long before NIST even had a reputation of being reputable in the cybersecurity field. In fact, back when I was where I was, and I know you were there at times, NIST was kind of a laughingstock. Did we at that other agency have a better handle of what security was at the time, and it just never translated well?
No. And the defense community early on, the whole DoD writ large, their notion of security when they started was protecting confidentiality of data. That was it.
Period.
Just,
yep.
Right.
Totally agree. Yep.
We don't want the Ruskies to read our data.
Keeping
well,
secrets.
and even more specifically, more often than not, it was. I mean, when I started at NSA, I went to work for the Communications Security Directorate, and it was after I got there it shifted over to information security. But the focus, confidentiality, but also data in flight, essentially.
Yeah, and that goes back more to the historic aspects as a communications agency. But the idea that security encompasses more, it encompasses the idea of integrity of the data, that it encompasses being able to be resilient in the face of attack to complete mission. Those things were totally left out of the early definitions. And as a result, those didn't get as much focus by outside because the early buyers, the early drivers of the computing marketplace were defense and the finance industry. And the finance industry didn't care as much about confidentiality. They were concerned about accuracy of mathematical calculations. And those were the things that people focused on early on. Think back to mainframes and some of the early mini frames. And those were the issues that the vendors were most concerned with.
Well, and you're addressing the I in the triad, the integrity. But now, as an industry, we're faced with all the ransomware, malware attacks that are now focused on availability, and we seem as a whole industry to be flat-footed at how to deal with that.
And even that CIA triad is insufficient because there are other properties. If we look at Don Parker's Hexad is a more expanded version, and that covers things like supply chain assurance. Are the things authentic that we're getting through the supply chain? That's not a confidentiality or integrity issue. That's a separate dimension. But we also then have in companies, there's the matter of reputation. Reputational security could be viewed as part of cybersecurity. What's happened to the reputation of SolarWinds and CrowdStrike and so on, and should be Microsoft as a result of recent incidents? That's something that if you were those companies, you would want to protect. That would be part of what you would have within your scope of protection. And any other organization wants to protect its reputation. That means something.
But again, that speaks to what you were saying earlier about all these companies are not in the business of however we define security for their clients. It's protecting themselves, making money, but indirectly reputation, most of us would agree, relates to the ability to make money.
Yeah. Well, they're not charities, right? It costs a certain amount to produce whatever it is as a product. But we, as consumers, regulated by agencies that presumably we have influence on, do not enforce a high standard of quality on what's produced. And this has been going on for a very long time. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. We've been emphasizing code getting out the door fast.
Right.
We haven't been emphasizing secure code, secure product, secure whatever, getting out the door at all. And that's your point, and I agree with you.
But aren't
And-
those incentives always at odds?
Well, that's the point. There's profit in getting code out the door fast. There's little to no profit or revenue or incentive to get secure code out the door. Who cares if it's secure? I want my new shiny now.
Well, it's not only secure, it's correct code, because a lot of the problems that we see that lead to security issues are from faults in the design or the production, which are just bugs, and we still have bugs. One could argue that the long history of blue screens that people had, even if it wasn't exploited by a malicious actor, was still a security problem because we have this availability issue. And again, this goes back to the fact that we do not have metrics. We can't say that vendor A is so much more than B, or to make an improvement, it would cost this much more and I'm willing to pay it. We aren't there yet. And as a result, look at the ecosystem we have. Pick any system that you want to talk about running as a generally available system. I'm going to leave out some specialized ones that exist in the marketplace that are used in like nuclear power or avionics. But just look at the big 3 or 4: Linux, Android, Windows, Mac OS. You would be insane to run the base system connected to the internet with no other security mechanism in place.
Huh.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So why is that? Why is it that we accept that the mass market system is vulnerable by default and we continue to give them money to give that to us? Why do we have to run 50 add-ons after the fact to have some sense of confidence that our enterprise is not going to get hacked today? We don't ask that question. We just accept that.
It's a great point. And you made the analogy to an automobile in this context. And I've since been thinking about that. And I think it's a great analogy because what you said was, when you go buy a car, you don't have to go to, the equivalent of CrowdStrike to get seatbelts, right? The equivalent of some other vendor to get brakes, some other vendor to get airbags. Like, that's all included in the vehicle. In fact, it brings up another interesting point. It's required by the U.S. federal government in laws that vehicles have those things.
Well, I was going to say,
different countries
Paul,
have different standards.
That's true today, but that wasn't always the case.
Right.
I mean,
Seat
when
belts?
I was a
You
little
want me to pay
kid,
for seat
there
belts?
were no seat belts. and the first time somebody died in a car accident is not when all the manufacturers started putting seat belts in the car. In fact,
I want to point out that while cars are customized, it's very rare that you get somebody to take their minivan and put a 350 in it or something. Okay. Whereas we trivially build our own computers, customize what we do, pick one of the 2 major operating systems to like there's not as much
3.
This is the year of the Linux desktop.
You thought you were going to get away with that on my show, huh?
Yeah. There is no Linux. There are about 50 Linuxes, but yeah,
that's
go ahead.
correct.
Linux I? Is it Linux I or Linuxes?
I don't know.
Whatever. So,
It's
but
Linux.
in all seriousness, Linux. But in all seriousness, like there's significant, like they expect you to buy a car as a unit that is complete and done, and you will not do very much to it except change the oil, change the tires, that kind of thing. That is not the way it happens on the computer. And the function of the computer is, well, these days most people use a computer as simply their dumb terminal to the internet and the various cloud services. That was not the original intent of computers in years gone gone by. You were doing stuff on your computer that occasionally you would get the unholy screeching that kids have no idea what it is anymore, and connect up to some BBS or very 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 bandwidth limited internet and do something with it. I mean, it took forever to pull down porn, for God's sakes. Okay, so you have to.
But you're making an argument for something like a Chromebook, right?
Well, yeah.
It's somewhat equivalent to the cars we buy, right? To mess with the BIOS, you got to like undo a screw in the motherboard, right?
But I think it
And
also
a Chromebook-
relates.
Go ahead,
So I think it also relates to the popularity today of what I'll loosely call cloud computing, virtualization. Organizations finally figured out how to get all the utilization out of that hardware that they were buying, because most people would buy computers, servers, and use 5% of its capacity. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know.
I'll make two comments here. One, to catch up on Chromebooks. That's a very interesting idea. That if you think about, well, where are Chromebooks largely used now? And it's students. And it's students because they don't know how to mess with it necessarily. They don't need to. But they're also a low risk environment. So the platform is matched to the risk and the population a little better. It's not perfect and it's used in other places, but I just thought I'd mention that, is that the idea of having to use the same system everywhere, the same commercial level system everywhere, is part of the problem. The fact that we would use something on a local PC all the way up to a departmental level or organizational level computer system is part of the problem. And rather than thinking about how do we engineer things for an appropriate use and risk environment. So that's I think one of the factors behind this. And it goes along with the idea of what is it we're measuring, what is the cost. There are systems there that are available commercially now, which, according to the best data I have never been hacked. Now, in part, that's perhaps because they aren't as widespread. They aren't out there with people downloading things off the net onto it, whatever it may be. But they were purposely designed using best methods to be impervious to attack. And it's a good thing because they're used in some, like nuclear power, they're used in space systems, they're used in military systems, but they're expensive. You're not going to be able to get the source code to make your own little additions and write your own driver for your toaster, because people generally don't have the training or the tools to do that, and that adds more attack surface. But if you're going to license something for $10,000 per CPU, which is what one of those systems had last I saw as a license for quantity 10, you're gonna be very reluctant to use that in a wherever
toaster.
Yeah, in a toaster. Yeah, control a toaster.
Very expensive toaster. Holy crap, expensive toaster.
That was one of my questions for you, Spaff, was how do we balance the openness of systems and the security baggage that comes with it if you buy into this, right? The more open the system, the more susceptible it is to security issues. The more of a closed system that you have, you can offer better security because you control, more aspects of that system but there's not as much freedom to let users do what they want. How do we balance this? I'm a huge proponent of open source and openness in systems, but I realize that a lot more of the security burden falls on me, perhaps, is part of the answer.
Yes. You were talking about automobiles and aftermarket modifications. If I'm buying vehicles for my company as delivery vehicles, I will specify to the vendor what I want as features, and I will pay extra for those features. But
Right.
I'm not going to let my drivers go in and adjust the timing on the engine because that takes away from the assurances that I have, whatever it is, whether it's mileage or tracking or maintenance, whatever it may
It
be.
voids the warranty.
What does that too?
Mm-hmm.
But in that kind of case, I'm willing to pay extra to have it produce the way I want for my environment. Now, you as an individual could go out and buy something. Maybe you get that minivan and you get a 350 and you install it yourself in the minivan, or maybe you convert it all to use a Ferrari engine that you somehow managed to fit into the thing. But you're the one taking the responsibility, and it's assumed that you have the capability to do that, and you're willing to pay the money. We need to, and again, this when I started off, and it's not meant to be pejorative for individuals. We have a lot of hobbyists, and we have a lot of infosec janitors. The hobbyists are the ones who are constantly tinkering and writing new drivers and deciding that they're going to interface this in a different way without thinking about that bigger picture of engineering and impact. The infosec janitors are the ones who are cleaning up the messes that the existing systems have. Really important jobs, but that's not engineering of designing the systems, building the systems, and operating them according to a specification, understanding how it is we make them robust. And that's where we need to get to. It's not easy. It means people have to adopt different practices, that just hacking out C++ code is not going to do it. It doesn't matter how well we train people to do that. It's going to require a different kind of, you were talking about discipline, process, right? You all touched on that in the earlier discussions. Exactly so. We need to have a different repeatable process with defined, well-designed tools so that we understand, and the underlying principles. We're not there yet. We're better than we were, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think that the challenge that I recognize, Spaff, is that we can build systems that are more resilient. However, we sometimes hesitate not to because it may hold us back to adopt new technology or innovate, right? So
Yep.
we build almost our own kind of walled gardens, and that's very secure. The real challenge is, how do I build those and allow the business to adopt new technology at the rate that most are adopting new technology, so we can keep up with the market?
I think there are two things that we need to change in the way we look at acquisition. And one is, we don't need compatibility up and down the chain. That the idea that everything has to be backwards compatible and compatible with each other and all our business partners is limiting in a different way, because it limits us from innovation for more secure kinds of systems. So that's one thing. And then the second aspect to that goes back to, how do we measure the difference? If we're willing to say, you can buy this widget and it's packed with the latest AI chips and it will go 10 times faster than what you're running currently. But according to these metrics, you have an additional 5% risk over the course of a year from a software failure that someone will get into your system and take your data.
Yeah. How do we predict risk,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Some of the conversations I have with the EPSS folks, right, is where they're trying to build models to do just that, right?
Or at least
For
bound
vulnerabilities
it.
and exploits.
Yep.
Yeah.
I keep trying to come up with like a different word that keeps with the theme of myths and misconceptions, because you've dropped a lot of things here in our discussion, Spaff, that talk about sort of the realities that we're still dealing with. Missteps, maybe myths, misconceptions, missteps.
No. Now you're talking about the thieves' world guy. Myth steps and misconceptions, and there's a
Yes.
whole series of books.
But
about,
I mean,
Fafit and the Gray Mouser.
yeah,
but
yeah,
but a lot of
the
what we've been
same
talking
guy, but not
about,
the
a lot
Skeeve.
of
It was Skeeve,
Skeeve.
and the
Yeah. Yes.
but a lot of what we're talking about are sort of like the current realities that haven't changed since the very beginning, and it's not a myth or a misconception. It's what we're dealing with is all I can come up with is the current reality or the current state, but we need an M word to reflect that. And that could be the next book or the appendix to the book that you write.
Could be. The more I get into this, and I'm a little unusual in sort of this.
In a lot of ways.
Well, in many ways.
As are we all.
As
sir.
we all are. Yeah.
Because it's not just computing that I've been studying over time, but psychology. I've been studying sociology, philosophy, and finding connections where some in the community, the academic community in particular, are very, very focused on mathematically defined kinds of things as what's traditionally been computing. And that's not simply in the academic community. I would say it's in much of the technical community. You mentioned this evolution from data security to information security. And for a while, then information assurance. And then we talked about resilience. And now we're talking about risk management. That's a transition that's been hard for some people to make, to understand how this broader context plays out. We're beginning to see that with AI as well. They're beginning to have to understand a broader context. I don't have a grand conclusion from that other than to say we need to be a little more open to what can we learn from other places. And that ties in with many other kinds of things about gatekeeping in the field, and who do we allow to to build things or work in our companies. That is another kind of misconception in the book, that you have to have a particular skill set. You've got to be an older white guy with a beard. Look at our,
Ta-da!
I feel seen.
Yeah. And that is maybe a little too prevalent in some circles.
Amen.
But yeah, we have more to learn. We're a young field. All right. So cybersecurity is about 50 years old as a recognized area. And computer science as a discipline really didn't. 1962, October 1962, was when the computer science department was founded at Purdue University. It was the first degree granting computer security program in the world. So
that was the year I was born, Spaf. Were you teaching there at that time?
I feel like it. And that's not that long ago.
But okay, back up a step though. Civil engineering, any other kind of engineering.
Oh yeah.
How long did it take from sort of creation as a recognized discipline until certification, licensure, that kind of thing? Like, how long does it take for these things to happen? Is it decades or is it centuries?
The fields develop over centuries, if not millennia. Okay. If you look at civil engineering, that goes back a very long ways. I'm blanking on his name, and I regret that. There was a software engineer that I was talking to, very well known in the field. I hate that I can't remember his name, but anyhow, it was about 20 years ago we were talking, and he said what we have to realize is that computer security, software engineering, is at the point in our development where in civil engineering they had not yet discovered the right triangle. And that's really profound. It's silly at first, but it's profound if you think about it some more.
Yeah.
In I think it was in Korea, that if you were designed a bridge and it fell and injured anybody, then you were buried in the rubble. Imagine if we did that to people who were software engineers. We'd have to have some kind of virtual rubble, but nonetheless, we don't hold people.
There'd be a CrowdStrike intern who'd be really annoyed.
Oh gosh. Yeah, we don't hold people accountable, and you look at the licenses for software, and they all disclaim liability. Why? Because we haven't gotten to the point yet where we have repeatable, predictable bounds on the behavior of things.
Speaking
I know I'm
speaking
talking
of who's
a lot.
responsible, though, I want to go back to one thing you said earlier, Spaff, that the CrowdStrike incident was is it as much Microsoft's fault as it's CrowdStrike's fault, or is it more Microsoft's fault, and why?
I would say, if I were to be assigning responsibility, I would say the majority of the responsibility should be attributed to Microsoft. And the reason for that is, first of all, they built systems that have to have all these add ons at a low level to be able to function in a safe way. And second of all, the mechanisms that they provide to these third party vendors don't have the safety rails or guards on them.
Mm-hmm.
That I believe both Mac OS and some versions of Linux have an encapsulation for low level device drivers that don't crash the machine if they misbehave. They are better defined.
Yeah, at the very least, it could be a user option to go, yeah, that's fine, don't load that driver, and continue on with life.
Yep.
Right? I think that's the way System D, if I'm, correct me if I'm wrong, audience, but I'm pretty sure that's how like System D, for example, handles it in Linux.
So there's that. Yes, CrowdStrike deserves some um, some part of the blame. It's a classic off by one error, which should be tested, should be known.
Right.
Their follow up of what they're going to do in the future now takes on these extra steps, which they didn't do originally because they hadn't calculated the risk or the cost, and they wanted to keep the cost lower. But then there's a third component, which is the organizations that were really crippled by this didn't do resilience planning. They didn't do alternatives.
They share some responsibility too. And I said that on the show. I said, we have these technologies such as BMCs and active management technology from Intel, basically the same technology or similar technologies that accomplish the same goals. And that is, if a system is powered on and it's connected to the network, I should be able to, as an administrator, go do stuff to that machine for cases pretty much just like this, right? I mean, it gives you a facility to rebuild the whole operating system remotely. I'm like, does no one use that correctly? Is that right?
That
But
okay.
I think
if they had ransomware and they were down for 2 weeks because they didn't have backups and hot spares, we would hold them responsible, not 100% because they didn't write the ransomware, but if they didn't take those kind of, in today's environment, you really should have that. I'm sorry, Jeff, I stepped on you there.
Oh, no, not a problem. I mean, talking about responsibility is a fun intellectual exercise, but the pragmatist in me is looking at liability, where all these organizations, the airlines, I suffered renting a car and I don't do that very often these days, but I had to go through all sorts of extra hoops, and all of a sudden it occurred to me, oh, they're suffering from CrowdStrike, the issue. Um, hopefully nobody's watching this episode and is going to present this in any civil case, but where does the liability fall in CrowdStrike Microsoft as this recent example?
Well,
in your opinion,
this kind of liability is actually something that lawyers are going to have to sort of hash out, and it really goes down to some of the fine print of licenses and things that people have taken on. Liability is an issue of risk shifting under the law, and that's not something that we would be able to say with any certainty here.
True.
That,
very true.
That's decided at the time that somebody takes on a product or licenses to use something.
But, which is an interesting observation, if I can interject real quick, because I agree with you. And ultimately, this is going to come down to case law and precedent that largely hasn't existed yet. And so all this waxing lyrical about myths and misconceptions in cybersecurity and what we should do in this undefined category of the reality of things the way they are, it's all going to come down to a courtroom and lawyers trying to figure it out, which I find
I think some of it might come down to Josh Corman gave an example when he was on the show of, I think, I don't know if it was Buick or one of the car companies back when they had wooden tires. There, someone crashed the car and it was due to a faulty tire, and they tried to sue Buick right? But it was really Goodyear that was held responsible, and it provided a foundation for case law of, they call it like the last line supplier.
Yep.
Like whoever
But that's
the
my
last
point,
line
Paul.
supplier is.
All,
Yeah.
all of our pontificating, all of us aged experts here, it's going to be decided by a whole different set of people with a
Correct.
whole different
Yeah.
set of
Decided
skills that don't know anything about
Well,
cybersecurity,
yeah.
but they know the law.
It's going to be not only lawyers but insurance companies, because that's part of the risk shifting environment. And it won't. There are a lot of lawyers right now that have advanced degrees in computing, and they bring people like us in as experts on the
Expert
case.
witness.
I've served as an expert witness on many cases.
Yep.
But let me also add here, there's a different kind of liability that we all are paying a tax because the products we're using are slower and more expensive because they're not produced in a quality fashion. They're not produced with those bounds. When something like the SolarWinds or CrowdStrike problem occur, the cost to society writ large is borne eventually by all of us. And we don't know that indirect tax that we've been paying for so long, but it is substantial. And that's part of the problem, is that we accept that. We're the frogs in the water being brought to a boil, that we put up with a lot of this nonsense because it keeps
Socialized
happening.
losses, privatized profit.
Yep. And
So, I mean,
I'm saying that because I think people should think about that in terms of what is it we're using and accepting on a regular basis, that is that really to our benefit?
Well, I think especially those of us that have worked in technology our whole lives, we go, yeah, it's computers. I've been fighting with those things since
Yep.
the beginning of my life. So
I sort of stepped on you there, Josh. You were about to say something.
go ahead, Josh.
So I mean, one of the biggest things in liability that I think is interesting and is going to happen in the next few years, in my opinion, is professional liability,
Mm-hmm.
certification, licensure, whatever you want to call it. But my father's a professional engineer. Teachers have certification,
Electricians come to mind.
electricians, plumbers. There's all kinds of trades and crafts and very important things that are certified. Nurses, barbers, for God's sakes. We don't have the same certification a barber does, for Christ's sake. Like, give me a break, But we have certifications. We have CISSP, we have CASP, we have ASS from Jeremiah. We have all sorts of certifications, okay?
Josh, thank you for the entree for that PCI moment, which you swore we wouldn't get to.
Oh, he did. He teed it up
He
so
teed it up so
for you,
nicely.
Jeff.
Except,
Peace-
Jeff, that's nothing
peace-
about PCI. It's about the person,
No,
not
but
the
No,
company.
But
actually,
PCI,
But I think
but-
that's just saying that Jeff is a certified ASS.
I am a
That
certified
too.
ASS.
That too.
But PCI
Does he have a hat?
For the attestations of compliance for all these merchants out there that claim to be doing all the right things and claim to be doing security, they have to be signed by an officer of the company, and the officer of the company, it can be held personally liable for breaches and loss of credit
And that's
card
good. That's a part of it, but that's not enough, Jeff. What about the person that does the actual assessment, the QSA that does the assessment, and they're a total idiot? And because I've met
But they
some
have
of
to be
those.
certified as well.
Yeah, and guess what? When they screw it up, do you know what happens? They go get another job with another QSAC.
Well, and contractually, I mean, I work for a QSA company. Our liability is limited to the cost of the engagement.
Yes.
And anything beyond that, you got to go to court and have some real clever lawyers.
And that's
go beyond
fine
that.
because you have to do the same thing to a plumber that screws up your house. You
Sure.
got to go to court. They're not going to come and arrest him and pull the money out of his wallet and hand it to you.
But again,
there's-
it all goes back to the lawyers. So what are we
But
talking
here's
about?
the thing:
We need a
there's
lawyer.
risk of loss of license. If you get a nurse that they screw up or a doctor that screws up, they're going to lose their license. They're not going to be able to be a nurse or a doctor unless they game the system some crazy which way. With us, sorry, go ahead, please, Spaf.
Yeah, sorry, we're running short on time. Spaff, closing thoughts.
Well, this goes back to the idea of having quantifiable, verifiable procedures and measures. That if we're going to have licensure, then there has to be standard practice that is traceable to something that shows results. In civil engineering, for instance, you have training over what materials to use and how to calculate stresses, and you can be held accountable if you do something that's outside the acceptable practice, the defined practice. We haven't done that in computing yet because we don't have those. So I think, just to circle around at the very beginning about the myths and misconceptions, what we've been talking about, really, if you think about it and you start probing down, is we have this sort of mythos that security is something understood, that we can train people and they can buy the right tools and apply it and things become secure. We're nowhere near that. It is still largely vague in spots, and we don't
It's an
have.
art.
It is an art. It is a hobby in many respects. We can do better, and this is something that, as people become aware, and thank you for this show to be able to talk about it, I think we can move forward. We just have to get beyond the point of believing that we know how to do it best, to get to the point of, well, what do we need to do it better?
Awesome. Spaff, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly this evening.
My pleasure, anytime.
With that, we will take a short break and come back and talk about the security news. Stay tuned.